everyone. This is Bill Curtis Davidson. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And we are just really excited to be here today to talk to you about DEI plus accessibility. And I'm really excited to be here joined by my panelists. Again, at PEAT, we focus on making sure that workplace technologies, including emerging tech like AI and XR, are accessible to people with disabilities and everyone. I'd like to thank the organizing team for inviting us to be here today. And right now, I'd like to have each of our panelists say a brief word of introduction.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Nirav Desai. I am CEO of a company called Moonbeam. We're globalizing creativity, building VR collaboration solutions to help creatives around the world have connections without having trouble.
And I'm Stephanie Montgomery. I'm Vice President of Research and Best Practices at the XR Association. And we're focused on bringing the responsible development of XR to life.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dylan Fox. I'm the Coordination and Engagement Team Lead for XR Access and a researcher on augmented reality for low vision at UC Berkeley.
Great. Before we get into the discussion, I'm going to cover some of the panel themes that we have today. And again, the title of the session is Designing and Developing for DEIA and Accessibility, And it's important because there are many initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion underway in so many different companies, large and small. And in recent years, again, with a lot of the social justice and different movements happening both inside companies as well as in our greater society, this is a very important area that many are paying attention to. However, accessibility is not always, or disability inclusion is not always a part of these initiatives. So it's important to note that this has become a lot more serious in recent years, and one of the reasons for that is President Biden in 2021 issued an executive order 14035 in June of 2021. And what this is it's a government-wide initiative that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion, plus accessibility. And if you're supplying any applications or technology to the federal government, or if you're a federal contractor, this is going to be very, very important and really have a trickle-down effect as well throughout the entire public sector. There's a very important development in XR in that there's a very large community of different stakeholders, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today, that have really been pushing inclusive design in extended reality and immersive tech. And the key thought here is that inclusive design should not be an afterthought. And in the disability community, in the accessibility community, there's a saying called "nothing about us without us." And really what this means is it means considering accessibility during all phases of development to make products better for everyone. It's important to note that when we do that, we're able to realize some broader benefits, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today with our panelists. And one of the ways in which we can be inclusive is to leverage directly the skills of people with disabilities, as well as other intersectional identities in immersive design. We're going to talk a little bit about this community today. We're lucky to have Dylan here from XR Access Initiative, which is at XR Access. And this is an initiative led by Cornell Tech with support from Yahoo and from PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. And really the goal of this community is to bring together multiple stakeholders from platform companies, technology developers, application content developers, to make sure that inclusive design and accessibility becomes an unremarkable part of all XR creation. So we're going to hear a little bit about the work that's happening in the community today. Also important is in recent years, given what we've all been through and what we're still going through, the world of work has changed, and hybrid work is really a part of how we're all operating now. it is so important that everyone that is able to use technologies, that they can participate in this hybrid workplace, whatever that means. This could be in a factory, helping with manufacturing. It could be remote workers who are working from home or from other distributed teams. Could be workers in professional roles or in education, what have you. Whatever the workplace is for you, we need to make sure that everyone can participate. And this really heavily involves a focus on immersive communication, collaboration, and meeting tools, which are core to a lot of the key use cases driving XR and immersive technology adoption. And it's also important to note that with a worker shortage, which I think all of us experience, whether it's at a restaurant or a hotel or facilities that we go to, it's important that people of all abilities are able to be upskilled and trained for jobs, including high demand jobs such as in clean energy or other areas where we're training up a workforce that really may not exist fully today. And workers of all kinds with all different kinds of abilities can often perform essential functions of jobs when they are able to access the technologies. So with that, we're going to move to our panel discussion. And I'm excited to talk about the first part of this. We're going to really kind of talk through first this DEI. And I'd like to start by having each panelist say a brief word about that. Before I do, I want to acknowledge that Pia Zaragoza, who was to be on this panel, unfortunately was ill and not able to attend. So we just want to acknowledge that her contributions to this panel leading all the way up to yesterday, and unfortunately she's not able to be with us today. But please check her out. She works at Springboard Consulting. So before we dive in, I want to set the stage and give each panelist a chance to talk about what does the DEI plus A mean to each of you. And Nirav, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Bill. So my story in coming to thinking about accessibility, kind of the personal one, I made the stupid decision of going motorcycle riding soon after starting a company, and promptly broke the left half of my body. So while I was trying to figure out how to start the company, what we were going to do, I'm unable to use half my body. It led me to learn more about accessibility technology, understand how, and it really changed my perspective to realize that more than a majority of us are partially disabled at some point in our life. So when we think about accessibility issues, we shouldn't be thinking of it as it's them. We should think about it as it, at any point, could be us. Mm-hmm. And that changes your perspective on how you approach accessibility. And it is, for me, it's a perspective. In the same way that diversity, I come with a unique perspective based on my background, based on my life experience. Similarly, the perspective is critical in understanding accessibility, because that perspective allows you to develop for an inclusive approach.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, would you like to add?
Yes, and I'm fortunate never to have an accident like that, and I'm going to keep it that way. That's my plan.
Advocate it.
So at XRA, we've known from the beginning that the more people we can have engage with XR technology, the more robust the technology will be. We have learned that from the history of technological development over time. And so we find it's very valuable to include the accessible part in diversity, equity, and inclusion as an addition to expanding the scope and the reach of XR technology as a whole. So that's kind of our vision and thought, and we have been working very hard on that ever since we started. Our members are really committed to making that happen.
And I think that the accessibility portion is really important to highlight, because not only are people with disabilities just as important to a marginalized group as people of different races or genders or orientations, But accessibility comes with its own set of technical challenges and opportunities. When you focus on accessibility, you're asking organizations not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk, right? It's no good to invite a person with a disability to your conference or to your panel if they can't register on the website, if they can't get on stage because it's not an accessible place. So we really want to make sure that people are committing to making their stuff accessible.
Great, thanks for those comments. I think it's super critical that as we involve more and more creators in the space and also look to have more diverse creators in the space, that understanding that accessibility and disability crosses all other kinds of diversity. So there are people with disabilities in this room, whether you know it or not just people on the panel, but other places. And it, again, it's one of those concepts that's pervasive. Okay, so, and against that backdrop, I think part of what we want to talk about today is the value that you can have from these, and just sort of interweave that a little bit. So I'd like to ask each panelist to talk about kind of, different design challenges that you can think of that have solutions that might be a disability-related solution, if you will, that may be sort of lower risk and higher reward. Like, as we get our thoughts around this topic, what does it mean to have something that's a disability-focused solution, but then has a bigger reward? And so we can start with maybe Nirav, with you as well.
Sure.
First, yeah.
Sure. Now, harkening back a little bit to the exploration I was doing while laid up, a low-hanging fruit, I think, across the VR space is captioning. I started using captioning as part of experimenting with accessibility technology, but I quickly realized, and when I talk a little bit about Moonbeam, I'll kind of share a little bit more about what we're doing around that. But there are so many tools available for captioning, speech to text, that it's not even. It's frankly making our product better. It's not that we're necessarily just designing for the hearing impaired. That's an inspiration, but it really opens up a wealth of opportunity on what else we can do. So that, I would say that's a low-hanging fruit that, with the amount of automation and AI to support automated captioning, we should have that on almost every VR application.
Great. Stephanie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see as a big challenge is for people who are low vision or blind, which a lot of us are wearing glasses and those kinds of things. Gets harder to engage, especially with graphic images and in the VR space and the AR space. And so one of the challenges we see there is how to keep those people engaged in those situations. And we are exploring the concept of building an accessibility object model that kind of would act like a screen reader. And the idea here is I watched a video a while ago about somebody who loves playing Fortnite but has low vision, and so he displayed what the screen looks like to him, and it's so different. If you know where everything was before, you might be able to make it work, but if you're a new entrant into this space, it's almost impossible. And so having just a text identifier on each of those graphics would be super helpful, or some kind of model. And so that's one of the things that our members have thought that would be a good challenge to tackle. And so we're exploring that with XR Accessibility and others to see if we can do something around that and provide an example for developers and designers to look at and say, oh, and then also potentially make a code snippet free if we can get that far. So that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, and I would add that there are some accessibility features that are difficult to implement, but there's a lot that are really easy, low-hanging fruit, that if you invest in them, yes, it'll make it accessible for people with disabilities, but it is almost guaranteed to make the app much better for everybody else as well. I think a great example of this is designing for low mobility, right? If you design your app such that you can use it while you are sitting or standing or lying down, you're making it usable for people who maybe are in wheelchairs or in hospital beds. You're also making it more usable for people who want to use it in a train or on a plane, or in a crowded expo hall. If you make something useful while it's usable with just one controller, well, you're certainly making it usable for people that only have one hand, but you're also making it usable for anybody whose controller runs out of battery mid-session. So thinking about things like that, thinking about enabling alternate controllers like Bluetooth keyboards and adaptive, the Xbox adaptive controller, anytime you make investments in that, it is going to have rewards for everyone, not just your users with disabilities. So it really is high reward.
Thanks for those great perspectives. I was thinking, as you mentioned, the adaptive controls, we're familiar with disability-led innovation coming out of places like Able Gamers. Some of you may have heard of them. Well, one of the things they did is hacked hardware, right, controls for so many years. And basically, when you look at the way people with disabilities use technology, they're the most great life hackers, right? They are using technology and figuring out how to often get around barriers, by the way, that aren't put in place for the technology. So, but there's a lot of creativity that I personally, as an ally in the community, I find very inspiring, but also just not inspiring, but just creative. It's extremely creative. So that's something that I think we all can benefit from. And that's part of where I wanted to go next is like, as we involve people with disabilities in the design process, we can unpack those different edge cases and try to understand how do you do this, right? Like if we're designing for these constraints or for use outdoors, right, in the sun, things like that. How can I benefit if I can literally integrate these perspectives, first of all, by having people with disabilities directly involved on your teams. And, but also there's an aspect of design research and user research. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that and, kind of how do you include, what are some ways to include people with disabilities or to do inclusive user research? Dylan, would you like to comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, I think there's 3 lines of research that I would really love to recommend here. The first is obviously researching the needs of people with long-term or permanent disabilities. If you talk to people that have had to deal with a lack of eyesight or vision or movement for much of their lives, you're going to get a lot of insights on how they have dealt with that over the years that you can then integrate into your application. It's really important because those people need and deserve equitable access to all of the things that we're applying XR for when it comes to training or travel or health. And so obviously making sure you include people with disabilities as part of your research is essential. The second one is multitaskers. I don't know about anyone here, but I find myself on rare occasions trying to do 2 things at once. And the truth is, when you are multitasking, you are disabled because some portion of your attention, some portion of your motion is being applied to a different task. So if you want people to be able to use your application and whatever else they're doing at the same time, making sure you research that and that you apply those findings is going to be really important. And finally, I just quickly call out also that elderly people are a really important portion of the population to conduct research with. We all, fingers crossed, become elderly one day, which basically means we are all disabled one day. And so paying attention to that nigh inevitable use case is again going to make your applications much better. I'd call it specifically, if you're interested in learning more about this, the XR Access Research Network has seminars every month that delves into various portions of really great research going on in academia. And also shout out to Thomas Logan, who runs the Accessibility VR Meetup and Equal Entry, because they've been doing amazing research in this type of thing for years.
Great. You have a couple of quick examples that you might want to share, either one of you?
Well, I've found the XR Access resources extremely useful. And speaking as the startup on this panel, it's a lot to take in, right? We all have different abilities, and testing for just one, it's hard to create a research panel with all the diversity of ability, particularly as a startup. And that's what I love what XR Access is doing. your standards have basically become a requirements document for our company, which is absolutely wonderful. And I love the contribution from the big players in that space. It's so critical for a startup trying to reach as large audience as possible.
Yeah, and XRA certainly supports research and has done a bunch of first research too. So it's something that we take as one of our core items, working with our big members to make those happen in targeted areas. So absolutely.
Great, and I think as we talk about doing inclusive user research involving people with disabilities and different lived experiences of intersectional identities as well, I think we're always trying to think about like how do we get to that broader value. Like so, Stephanie, I think we were talking in prep for this a little bit about like what are some of those aspects like that are valuable for everybody. Like I think you talked about pacing and things, so maybe you want to comment a little bit on that.
So things that are can be valuable to everybody's when you think about your design, and when you do that you think high contrast, right? Mm-hmm. That can help everyone to see maybe there's something you want to target, or pacing in an experience where you want people to be able to move faster or slower and have that decision to make on their own. That helps people with accessibility or cognitive who need to have a break and move along, but it also can help people who just get it faster and want to race through it or really enjoy the experience, right? So those are some things that are very useful as like simple design things that are already being in place. I mean, teleportation is a big one, right? In early experiences, you walked everywhere in VR, right? And now teleportation is so much more friendly when you're doing an experience. Those are good things that are good, and we're seeing them come along now in this space.
Yeah, that makes me think of like walk-in VR, for example. And Dylan, you touched on this earlier. Maybe you want to talk a little bit just briefly about what that is, because it kind of directly relates to what she just said.
Absolutely. So walk-in VR driver is a great piece of software. It's something that's you can apply on the user end instead of having to ask developers to plug in, which is great. Only works with Steam VR the last time I checked. But it's the type of thing where it'll enable co-piloting. It'll enable you to bring up different, pretend your arms are in different places, pretend your motions are bigger or smaller. And those types of capabilities are just, again, incredibly useful to people with disabilities, but also if we could get that type of functionality integrated on a more widespread basis, people always talk about having gorilla arms from waving your arms around in VR all day. That could be a problem we could solve with that. I'd also love to add on, one of the benefits that I think people don't often see is that when you make your application accessible to people with disabilities, oftentimes you're making it accessible to machines. And that opens up a ton of potential benefits for all of your users, right? If you make the words that people are saying available to users via captions, well, you're also making it available to machines who might be able to do, for example, real-time translation. And so by doing the work to make something accessible, you often find you're at the same time doing the work to empower yourself to make amazing features at the same time.
Can I add something?
Sure.
So Dylan, what you were talking about just kind of sparked a train of thought in my mind, and I think back in the history of the mouse, right? And what led to amazingly successful interface with the mouse or the gamepad. And it was the idea of taking a very small motion to change the world, right? We're reversing the paradigm to a large degree because we want to get immersion in VR. So we have gorilla arms, right? We're flapping arms around in order to do anything. But I would think about both the inspiration of the mouse, the accessibility aspects of that, how you could make small motions to make dramatic change in a experience, as a motivation for how we want to design in a way that allows people to do more, not less. And it just your comments kind of seem to play into that, and I need to check out Walk-in VR.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, accessibility features can feel like superpowers sometimes, right? I don't know if anybody has played Half-Life Alyx, but they have these gravity gloves where you can just flick your wrist and something will fly across the room to you. And that feels like a superpower. It's also an accessibility feature, right? There's a lot of people that can't walk across the room and pick up something off the floor, but they can do that. and at the same time being able to maximize it, swing your arm and part the seas, that is both at once. So.
Yeah.
Right.
Great comments. Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of brings us into the topic as we kind of move towards the latter part here is I want to go back to hybrid work. It's a topic that we explore quite a bit. In fact, with, we'll talk a little bit later about some research we've done with the XR Association and work that's happening in our community. But, as we look at this topic of these superpowers, and then we think about being inclusive, especially in hybrid work, we wanted to kind of have you, Nirav, talk a little bit about your startup and what you're doing with Moonbeam, which really is squarely in this space of immersive collaboration and innovation. So maybe you can share a little bit with us.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, and I don't want to go into detail advertisement for my company, but I do want to highlight a few. What you're looking there on the screen is a screenshot of a meeting we're having in our platform, Moonbeam Envision, visualizing various kinds of data in a variety of different ways. You can see there's a 2D map as well as a 3D map, whiteboards to make it easy to communicate with each other. On the back left, you see that's actually our transcript. So there you see the transcription of the whole meeting taking place, and action items are automatically being pulled out, questions are being pulled out. As you're talking, we're using conversational AI to do that. And we can actually turn on captioning below the person speaking. So again, that's an option that someone may want, may not want, whether they're have hearing challenges or they're in an airport and it's loud around them. You may want to have subtitles on. So the key element here then with this shot is very busy. And the reason is that we were showing how there's a variety of ways to do almost anything in the platform. And that's a very overt accessibility approach towards accessibility. Clearly, we default in certain ways, but we have multiple ways of doing almost anything to allow as many people to use it as possible. Sorry, one other thing is, a lot of this also, one of the biggest challenges I had when I was recovering was getting on a plane. Getting on a plane, actually having to travel for a business meeting is insanely difficult when you have any mobility challenges. And the more we could do with hybrid work, remote collaboration, the more we can enable creativity and that creative communication to take place, the better off the economy is going to be, and the more equitable all of society will be. So that's really what we're trying to do with this, is not replace travel, but enable everyone to be part of the economy.
Great comments, thank you. And I did want to comment a little bit on Nirav. We've had a working relationship here for a couple of years. Of course, I just met him yesterday, IRL, right? Just like all of you probably. But anyway, I did want to say as well that, and we'll talk in a minute about community. That's what we're talking about next as we move towards the end. But Nirav's startup just has been working with our community, right? You just get involved. You don't know how to do all of this or how to learn from it, and there are others in the audience. I see some others of you out there who are also working with the community. So you can get started, and I'd like to move right into that next, actually. Just kind of invite you to join us. I'm first going to mention XR Access Symposium, and then Dylan's going to talk a little bit about XR Access since he's the coordination and engagement lead. We're really excited to extend an invite to you next week. Fortunately, you're not missing it. It's going to be the 4th annual XR Access Symposium, June 9th and 10th. And you can register by going to bit.ly/XRAccess-2022-AWEUS. And we're super excited this year because we're going to have remarks from the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Labor, Taryn McKenzie Williams, my client, and who funds Pete. And we're going to have a keynote by Accenture about their nth floor enterprise metaverse. And it's not just going to be any type of discussion because, of course, we're going to be talking about disability inclusion in the metaverse in a very large corporate setting. And I think you're going to be very surprised to hear about the creative ways that they have integrated disability inclusion, workplace accommodations, and just really working in this space, because it's not all easy to figure out, and it's going to be really great. And there's some research practices and innovation. And here I'm just showing a really quick example of what's going on. And Dylan, I might ask you to just sort of comment on XR access in general as we leave this slide up. I'm showing a slide here, really brief visual description of the nth floor metaverse, which is in AltSpace VR, viewed through Oculus headsets, but as well as desktop. And here we're seeing different Accenture employees' avatars congregating in a digital twin of Accenture's campus. And there are going to be speech captions and other things that we will talk about next week. And so please join us next week. And Dylan, maybe you want to comment about XR Access?
Yeah, absolutely. XR Access was really founded on that idea of nothing about us without us. Our goal is to be a place of community, a place where people with disabilities can come and make their needs heard, but also for any of the people who are trying to make their applications accessible, right? Platform creators, educators, healthcare workers, anybody who wants to be an equitable part of the future of XR is welcome to come to join the symposium, of course, and to join our Slack, to join our newsletter, to join our community. I'll add as well that if this is something that matters to you, and I hope it is, we are also always looking for organizational members as well, because we are all, trying to do this, but we are a relatively small group, and this is a really big challenge. So we do offer memberships that are free for nonprofit and universities, and pretty reasonable rates for small and large companies, because it's going to take all of us coming together to solve some of these big challenges. But I think we are definitely equal to the challenge with your support.
Great, thanks. And then Stephanie, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about developer resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So at XRA, we have been working on this, and we started a few years ago, actually, developing our developer's guide for accessibility. And that document, I'll get into it in the next slide, but it's a guideline document of considerations for developers to use when thinking about what they're building through the lens of accessibility. The next year, realizing that just having a document is really not sufficient, we worked together with XR Access to launch the XR Accessibility GitHub site. What was interesting here was, one of the things that's interesting here was that XR Accessibility was not yet taken on GitHub. So that just speaks to how much we need to think about it more as a community. This is intended to be a repository for tools, code snippets, et cetera. Anybody can add to this repository. It's supposed to be a living document. So we're building it over time, but as you all work in this space, add things that you want to share with other developers, please feel free to go to the GitHub and put in a submission, and we'll get it added. So this is a resource for all of you to use. Some of the key recommendations in our documents, in our developer's guide, are guidance around, general access. Nirav pointed out that his image was really busy, right? And he said, no, I wouldn't normally do that. So simplify your images, cut down on distractions. Use text and fonts that could be adjusted, things that could be made bigger or larger, adjust contrast. And think of all these things in advance before you even put pen to paper. As you're building the design in your head, think about it then. Are you gonna have captions or volume adjust? Are we gonna be able to do sign language one day? It's going to be good enough on our hand tracking to be able to do sign language. That's going to be so exciting. I keep trying that every time I go into Workroom Horizon. So, mobility, physical access, do things to address that. Limit movement. Have a sitting option. That's really nice, right? If one day your legs are exhausted and you just want to play that game sitting, you have the option to do it. And if you're in a wheelchair or half your body's not working, you have that option then too. And the last thing is with cognitive access. Have a point in the game where you can just take your user can just orient, or in your experience, your user can just orient. They can get rid of the distractions, things that aren't essential but are nice to have to the experience you're trying to create, and to help them to navigate through the experience overall. Those are just some of the key recommendations. The developer guide is free on our website, so you're welcome to go and download it. And then our third thing, which I already mentioned, our next step is to actually build a solution in this space around people with low vision. So we're continuing
Great.
to advance here with our members. And with XR Access, and pulling in other members of the community too. I mean, as Dylan said, as Nirav said, it's going to take a whole village continuously pushing on this to make it happen. And I want to say, but this industry now has an opportunity to do this from the beginning, right? We have seen the rise of many other technologies, 70s, 80s, and 90s, where it's all looked at after. But we have a unique moment here where we can look at it at the beginning. And I think we should all take that opportunity.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists. As we wrap up, I'm just going to quickly mention the PEAT Inclusive XR and Hybrid Work Toolkit, which talks a lot about all of these things that the panelists have so graciously shared today. You can find it at PeatWorks on Twitter. That's P-E-A-T Works, or peatworks.org/inclusive/XR-toolkit. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much to all of you for attending our session. Hope you have a great rest of the AW conference.